You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Hannah, but today's case is about Glen Brittner, who was found murdered inside of his home. Now, it's hard enough knowing that so many lives are ended in horrific ways, but when you hear that a victim was at the best point of their lives, had healed through so much, and had come out stronger only for this to still happen, that's what truly breaks hearts. The knowledge that sometimes the pain doesn't ever end. Sometimes, instead, your life does. But I don't tell this story to make you sad. I tell it in honor of people who deserved happiness and who deserve a spotlight as bright as the sun. And if you don't know, it is my absolute passion to tell these stories. I mean, absolutely no harm or disrespect when I do so. And I'm also doing Foul Play February this month, where I am posting so much on Thursdays and Sundays. If you would like to come back and support, it would mean the world to me. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 2015 in California, and Glen Brittner worked and lived in Llano. Glen was a 59-year-old business owner, and he actually owned Brittner Water Delivery, which was a water supply company, but he used his home as an office on the 26200 block of East Avenue W8. This was a successful business with many loyal customers, and Glen was actually a father of 3 grown children. I found the names of 2 of them, George and Derek. I couldn't find the third, but he was also a grandfather of 1 boy at this time, and he had another grandbaby on the way. Now, Glen would let his family come and camp on his land since he had multiple acres, and he also lived alone, so he loved the company. But Glen wasn't always one to be working. He also had fun, and he loved engineering projects and mastering that. He loved making music, working with his hands. He was said to have a brilliant mind and can remember facts, figures, and events like an encyclopedia. Now, he would also work as a mechanic, a plumber, a welder. He was good at pretty much anything. He was kind of like a jack of all trades. But Glen was also one of the men who would invite strangers in his home for dinner. If he didn't know a stranger, he made friends with them instead. He invited them in. He was super generous. He was happy, and he was content. But Glen had not always been like this. He had struggled to find happiness in his life for quite a long time. You see, just 4 years prior, Glen had become what was classified as a hoarder. Now, he was suffering from compulsive hoarding or persistent difficulty to discard or part with possessions because of a perceived need to save them. Now, this can actually develop from extreme OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, hoarding is often thought of as kind of a joke to people, which is very heartbreaking, but they'll say, if they have a small mess or they don't want to clean up or they don't want to get rid of something, they'll be like, oh, I'll just be a hoarder. But that joke is a little harmful because of how much suffering people who have a hoarding disorder really go through. Hoarders find it extremely difficult to overcome this because they do not collect items just to display or to organize or just because they even like that item. It can often be random, differing items that in their minds they may need in the future, they may have an attachment to for whatever reason, or it could just be that they feel safe surrounded by those items and they can't give them away without losing that safety net. These individuals aren't nasty. They aren't lost causes. They are in desperate need of help, even though their surroundings look like they don't necessarily want that help, and sometimes they can say they don't want that help. But Glen was in this situation as well at this point, and in fact 2 to 6% of the population suffers from this. It doesn't just affect the home environment either. It can often affect work and family, and they can have trouble functioning in general because of it. They don't want people to come to their home and judge them. They don't want people trying to talk them out of it, and they don't want anybody to make them throw something away that they're not ready to. It can be extremely distressing when someone wants them to do any of those things because they simply do not see this as a problem the same way others do. Or even if they do, it's still a mental block in their brain, and they can't help the fact that it would make them distressed to see this item go. But sometimes the items that hoarders will collect is not just trash or clothing or normal items. Sometimes it is actually animals. But animals to a greater extent and more of a larger number than the normal number of animals you would want in your home. Now, some of you may know the show Hoarders on A&E that was on for about 11 seasons, and they do a wonderful job with explaining how individuals got to this place and helping them through it and seeing how difficult it is for these people. It's not just they're lazy and don't want to clean. It's not just they didn't throw this out so it just collected over here. It's a true distressing moment for them to say goodbye, and this show actually goes through and helps them through it. Has a psychologist, gets rid of it, and tries to help them for a long period of time, for the rest of their lives, and not just the immediate show, you know? It shows the heartache, the pain, the real people behind these disorders, and I think it's a wonderful show. It was actually canceled in 2013, but in 2011, Glen Brittner was actually on this show. He had a whole episode made about him, well, and there was another woman in that show as well. Most of the time they do 2 different shows or 2 different individuals and weave their stories together, but Glen was focused on his rat collection. Now, before you get too grossed out, you know, it's not as gross as you think. In fact, he really believed and treated these animals like they were his pets, like they were his family, his children. It wasn't something where he just let his house get super gross and let them invade. I mean, technically it is, but to make it less gross for you, this is how I had to think about it. It's that he truly believed they were pets to him and they just kind of took over his home rather than him not wanting them there and then suddenly they took over, if that makes sense. So his rat collection had grown from 3 rats to 2,000, and he truly believed that he loved them, and he did love them. He did everything he could to make them feel at home, to make them feel loved, and the problem was they had taken over his home and they were loose in the walls and the cabinets and the furniture, and he treated them so well that he would sit on the floor and have them climb on him to eat the food. It was just like having cats and dogs to him. He loved them. He wanted to be around them, but this was becoming a problem. You see, it had become unsafe for the rats to live in this environment anymore due to the small house and the amount of rats that were in there, and they were destroying the home. They were also getting sick and passing away, and Glen knew he had to do something, but this wasn't easy for him at all, and he did not want to let any of them go. He would spend 20 hours a day cleaning his house, and then he wouldn't even live there anymore because he couldn't, because they had kind of overtaken his house. It was said at this time he was finally ready for help, and that is when he called Hoarders, the show. You see, hoarding can often be brought on by a traumatic event, something that individuals have difficulty coping with, and so they turn to hoarding to basically use these items for comfort or for help in what they're dealing with. It can also be due to a personality that is super indecisive. It can start from the age of 11 years old and get worse with age. It can also be brought on if you have family members that are hoarders around you and you grow up into that and it just becomes part of your lifestyle. It's not truly clear what the exact causes are for hoarding, but Glen knew exactly when it started for him. You see, Glen had told the show that he had once been married to this beautiful, perfect woman, and they had 3 children together, a magical life. Glen was so incredibly happy. But he said that on September 11th of 1985, he was driving around town when he saw his wife's truck, which she had gone out around town too. He saw his wife's truck at the fire department that was parked there, and he went up to say hi to see what she was doing, and he found her slumped over in the truck's seat. He immediately tried to resuscitate her and could not do so, and she had actually died at 39 years old of a heart attack, and Glen kind of blamed himself for not being able to save her, and he never dealt with those feelings. This had escalated into him using rats as a way to love something and not let it go. And upon starting the show, Glen was told that he would need to get rid of all of his pets, and he was completely heartbroken. He said he was going to keep just one, and When he was asked which one, he kind of broke down because he said that the one that was his favorite, the one he had the longest, had actually just recently passed away. And he started crying because she was the mother of many of the rats in his home. And so he said he still needed to pick the one that he wanted to keep. And he said it was kind of a breakthrough moment for him. And he said he really was slowly realizing that he kept so many of them because he wanted so much life around him that if one died, there were still so many that it helped with that grief. He was slowly realizing that his grief and loss had caused all of this to happen, and he agreed that they could help him catch all of the rats and bring them to better homes. They promised that they were rat experts, that they wanted the best for these rats, and they were going to get every single one they could and bring them to a safe environment. Glenn did such a wonderful job through all of this. He was determined to do this more for them than even for him because he knew it was getting to an unsafe level. And the only problem came when he had to put down one of the rats that was very sick. He needed a moment to process the loss he was going through, and the psychologist on set was really worried that he had never dealt with the grief he had experienced prior and had never gone to counseling, and that this was going to make him spiral. That the rats were pretty much the one thing that kept him from feeling like he was alone, but they made sure he knew he wasn't alone. And he did end up saying that they could put down the rat because they said that it would be in less pain that way. And Glenn seemed like such an empathetic soul that just didn't want any more pain for anybody, including himself. The one rat that Glenn decided to keep was named Commander Whitehead, which actually turned out to be a girl, which he thought was really funny. And the team managed to find this certain rat, and he got a clean bill of health, so Glenn would take him home. But Glenn did break down towards the end of the day to the psychologist again, talking about his wife and the feelings that were coming up again. And thankfully, the psychologist was there to talk to him, and Glenn really did show signs of healing through this and wanting hoarding to be a thing of the past, and knowing that he needed to deal with his loss of his wife, and that would help with the loss of the rats too. Now, the second day of cleanup, Glenn seemed in a much better spirit. He was laughing as the rescuers were kind of having to chase the rats around that were still remaining because they were super hard to catch. He was always saying that the rats are super smart, super human-like, and that's why he loved to be around them, because they weren't like having an animal. They had their own personalities. Before they left, Glenn went into the truck and he said goodbye to all of them. You know, he watched them go. He said he was really going to miss them, but they were going to be going to a better life, and somebody could be extremely happy with them. He even continued to go on to catch the strays that he found, and he would put them up for adoption. He wouldn't even keep them. He was determined to make this work and to not let hoarding take over his life. He also began going to see a therapist to help him with everything he had gone through, and he stuck with it too. And that's when 4 years later, he was living in a clean home. He had his own business, and he was happy, successful, properly dealing with his emotions. He was surrounded by family, and he had been using a wheelchair at the time, actually, because he had some problems with his legs, but that didn't stop him. He was still an incredibly happy man, and everything was going his way. He loved spending time with his grandson, and he was known as the best grandpa. He was said to have made a full recovery. Then on August 18th, 2015, everything was brutally taken from him. This had been a long time since the show, and his days as a hoarder, and his employee came to work at his home, which doubled as his office, around 10:30 a.m. And he immediately found Glenn inside his home with his hands and feet tied. Now, this was with zip ties. He was also nowhere near his wheelchair. His wheelchair wasn't anywhere to be seen. He couldn't get up even if he wanted to, but he couldn't because the worst part was he was bleeding from his head. However, Glenn was still alive. Now, the employee called 911, and when they arrived, Glenn wasn't responsive. He couldn't speak. He was in a critical condition, and he was airlifted to the hospital where he went into a coma due to the severity of the blunt force trauma to his head.
In the meantime, a man found bound and beaten at a Llano home, and his family says he was a victim of robbery. Eyewitness News Inland Empire reporter Leticia Waters is there live where the search is on for his attacker. Leticia?
Well, right now, the investigators with the LA County Sheriff's Department are still on scene looking for clues. They tell us that this location here is a water business along with a home that belonged to the victim. Now, around 11 a.m., an employee at the business showed up here to load his truck up with water, and it was while he was refueling the truck that he went to look for his boss and found him inside the home, bound, gagged, and beaten. Now, the victim, identified by family as 63-year-old Glen Brittner, was flown to the hospital. His family says he appears to be stable despite some significant injuries. Investigators are not revealing a motive, but families say it appears that it was robbery. Now, anyone with information is asked to contact the LA County Sheriff's Palmdale Sheriff's Station. That number there is 661-272-2477.
Meanwhile, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department went to investigate at his home, and they searched his property and found that his home had been ransacked. Now, whoever had done this had taken $2,000 as well as TVs and power tools. Investigators believe that at least 2 men had done this. Now, they also knew that it had occurred either August 17th or August 18th, so the day prior or that day or throughout the night. And this is because he had been seen in the morning of August 17th and he was completely fine. But investigators could not determine exactly when he was attacked, how he was attacked, how he lost consciousness, or what item was actually used to hit him. They had no evidence of anything. They only knew that it did significant damage, and there was also no sign of forced entry. So, investigators believed that the entry door was either open and somebody walked in, or Glenn knew who did it and had invited them into his home like he often did with strangers. But for the next 10 days, Glenn was still in a coma and he never regained consciousness. Then he lost his battle and he died at the hospital on August 28th at 9:22 a.m. while his family and the community mourned him. Now, the sheriff's detective Joe Espino held a news conference and he said it was totally unwarranted. This man suffered a tragic death that shouldn't have occurred. It was not worth the cost of a human life. Now, investigators believe that the killer or killers could have taken advantage of Glenn being so welcoming and allowing strangers inside his home, and that they could have noticed what he had inside when they were there and decided that they needed to steal it from him. However, the motive to kill him would literally have only been that his killers who were robbing him didn't want him to go to police saying that they had done it after seeing them, but no one knew other than that why anyone else would want to kill Glenn. His son Derek said, "It's unfortunate to all of us that he doesn't get to see our family grow through my brother and my sister." Now, investigators were begging for tips in this case and even raised a $20,000 reward for information. 3 years later, they were still begging for tips in this case. And his kids were desperately seeking answers as to why their father had been killed.
An emotional plea to catch the killer of a man in Llano, Glen Brittner, was found bound and beaten at his home in August of 2015. Investigators still don't have any suspects. As Eyewitness News reporter Giovanna Lara tells us, a reward is now being offered.
He was often blind to what was being done to him.
More than a year after the home invasion robbery and brutal killing of his father, Glen Brittner, Derek Brittner fights back tears, describing how generous and kind his dad was toward strangers.
He would always want everybody, whether they had money or not, to have water for the children and animals.
The 59-year-old Brittner was featured on the season finale of the A&E show Hoarders in 2011 when his rat collection spiraled out of control. But he also ran his own company called Domestic Water Delivery in Llano, providing service to the community.
If they couldn't pay for water, he would trade work. He would let people in to work for him. And most often, those are the people that that would take personal advantage.
In August 2015, Brittner was found bloodied and unconscious, his hands and feet bound with zip ties. He was robbed of power tools, TV sets, and $2,000 in cash. Authorities believe Brittner's killers may be among those he welcomed into his home. But after a year-long investigation interviewing dozens of people, they are nowhere closer to solving the crime. The department now offering a $20,000 reward in the hope it will trigger someone's memory.
This man suffered a terrible and tragic death that shouldn't have occurred. For something as menial as tools and television sets, it was not worth the cost of a human life.
His brother Gary said, "I think people should come forward with information to protect themselves and the community from the murderers. Justice is screaming for closure to this evil deed. How could someone be so cowardly and vile as to attack and beat a nearly 60-year-old crippled man to death?" Glenn was a businessman providing an essential domestic and agricultural water delivery service to many loyal and valued customers in the high desert since the late 70s. Now, this is the current wanted posters for information in this case, begging anyone who has information to call LA Crime Stoppers at 800-222-TIPS. Glenn's son, George, said, "I would like the public to know that my father was one of the greatest assets to our beloved communities. My father was well known throughout this entire region, and so many people in these communities have been devastated by this murder. For myself, running his company and being here in what he has built, his shop, etc., helps me feel close to him. I'll never fully be able to heal the wounds that were inflicted upon all of us until his murderers are caught and behind bars." Now, unfortunately, as of today, his killer, or killers, are still on the loose. And please come forward if you have any information regarding this case and give the Brittner family closure and justice. Even if it's such a minute detail that you don't think it matters, it does matter, and there's ways to stay anonymous in your tips. No one will ever have to know it was you. I also want to touch on hoarding disorder in case any of you out there are struggling. There is a website I found called hoarding.iocdf.org with webinars and resources that could really help you, and it's also based on your area, so you can find things that are nearby you as well. There is also a special place for families who are dealing with family members who have a hoarding disorder to better be able to help your loved ones, because I think it's such a wonderful website because you deserve help. And even if it's just a thought in the back of your mind that maybe you might be struggling with this, but you know, you don't want to really say anything, you don't think it's that bad, I think that thought is there for a reason, and you shouldn't just push it down. And same goes to families of a suffering hoarder, because it can really make you feel bad when you see them suffering, but then they tell you they're fine and you don't know what to do. But I think if the feeling is there, that says so much. And if you don't know where to turn, if there's no one to help you, if you feel out of control and helpless and don't know what to do for them, this can be a brilliant website to turn to, because you're not a bad person for wanting to help, and they're not a bad person for dealing with this. It's just something that may take a little bit of work and strength, but you guys can deal with it, especially together. It'll make it even easier together. Glenn just seemed like such a wonderful human that deserved the world, and I hate to see people who have overcome so much who are just pushed down into that darkness again, and there was no reason for this to happen to Glenn. He had a wonderful job, a business that he was running. He had literally decided to change his whole entire life and get help when he didn't even think he deserved it for so long. And then somebody comes along and beats him to death. For what? Why? You cannot tell me this man deserved that. And I hope that his killers get what they deserve, whether that's karma or whether that's a jail sentence. I hope I could bring to light kind of a hoarding disorder, because I think it's not really talked about other than this one show. I really knew nothing about it, and I think this show, the A&E show Hoarders, does such a good job of making them human, because so often we see mental disorders as this textbook definition rather than an actual human being with layers as to how they got to that point, or even how they were born like that. And it matters. They matter regardless of what they're going through. So I know it can sometimes seem it can sometimes seem gross. It can sometimes seem like, why would you live like that? But they can't help it. And so empathy is always the best way to look at things, even if it takes you a little bit more to find that empathy and to reason with how they got there. Sometimes they don't even have a reason. Sometimes they can't even tell you why they do it or why they can't stop. You have to look at the world with feelings and with thoughtfulness, and with, even if it takes you getting into their shoes, there are reasons why people are the way they are. And oftentimes it's not just upon the first glance that you'll find the answers. And so Glenn was much more than his hoarding disorder. He was much more than his losses, but it took him a while to figure that out and figure out his worth. So I hope you all take Glenn's story and use it as a positive reinforcement for yourself, that he made it out, that he became this happy person he wanted to be. And you can too. But for what was done to him, I will forever hope that Glenn and his family gets justice. And I hope that this is shared to the right people and they come forward with that information. It's been too long, and this needs to be solved. So don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces, okay?